A young botanist just broke her village's most sacred law. Alara stepped into the whispering woods, knowing it could mean permanent exile, but the slow death of her own garden left her no choice. She believes its fading life is tied directly to the forest's unnatural silence, a silence that speaks of a deeper, magical decay. By the end of this story, you will understand the forgotten ecology of magic and how ancient forests became living systems once more. What secret does the forest hold that could restore balance to the entire world? And what sleeping power begins to stir when the first leaves rustle her name? What would you risk to heal a dying world? Her palms met the ancient bark, cool and rough against her skin. Closing her eyes, Alara poured her own life force into the sentinel tree, a silent, desperate offering. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then a deep shudder ran through the colossal trunk, a vibration that traveled up from the roots and into her very bones. A soft, green luminescence awakened within the bark, pulsing like a slow, steady heartbeat. This light flowed outwards in a gentle wave, washing over the surrounding ferns and mosses. Where it touched, withered leaves unfurled with new vigor, and the grayish moss regained its vibrant emerald hue. The air itself seemed to sigh with relief. But the moment of triumph was shattered by a sharp voice, cutting through the newly awakened silence. "Stop. You violate a sacred trust." Alara spun around to find a man standing at the edge of the clearing, his form tall and rigid. His eyes, the color of weathered oak, held no warmth, only a stern, unyielding judgment. This was Kale, a warden of these woods, and his presence made the air grow cold again. "You think you can force life back into this place with a reckless act," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have broken the oldest law. This balance is not for mortals to mend with brute force." Her heart hammered against her ribs, screaming at her to run, to flee back to the safety of exile. But the memory of her dying garden and the brief, beautiful resurgence she had just witnessed rooted her to the spot. She chose to stand her ground. "I am not forcing anything," she argued, her voice trembling but clear. "I am giving. The forest is not in balance, it is starving. It is dying, and my village is dying with it. Our gardens fade because the woods have fallen silent. I came here to listen, and what I heard was a cry for help." Kale took a step forward, his expression unmoved. "Your help is a disruption. You have alerted things that should remain asleep. You have made your mission impossible by painting a target upon your back for every guardian in these woods. The forest itself now watches you, and it will judge whether your intent is pure or merely another form of human arrogance. Your boldness has not healed anything, outsider. It has lit a fuse. A fragile truce hung in the air between them, as delicate as a spider's web. Alara knew a single wrong word could shatter it. She held Kale's stern gaze, her own resolve hardening. "I can prove the forest has not cast me out," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Follow me." Without waiting for his agreement, she turned and led him deeper into the woods, away from the sentinel tree. Kale followed, a silent, brooding shadow, his presence a constant reminder of the danger she was in. The path was treacherous, choked with tangled roots that seemed to grasp at their ankles, and shrouded in a mist that clung to the skin. Alara moved with an instinctive grace, her steps sure as if the very earth guided her. She stopped before a fallen log, its surface blanketed in a peculiar gray fungus that looked utterly lifeless. "These are moon-touched fungi," she explained, her voice a soft murmur. "My village's oldest tales say they only react to a trusted touch. They are dormant now, waiting for a sign the forest itself approves." Kale watched, his arms crossed, his expression one of profound skepticism. "This is a children's story." Alara ignored him, kneeling and placing her palm gently upon the cool, damp fungi. She did not push her life force this time. She simply offered a quiet greeting, a feeling of gratitude and respect that flowed from her heart through her fingertips. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft, silver light began to emanate from the center of her touch. It spread outwards in intricate, glowing patterns, and as it did, the gray caps of the fungi swelled and unfurled, blossoming into luminous, cup-shaped flowers that cast a gentle, moonlight glow onto their faces. Kale took an involuntary step back, his stern mask finally cracking. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. He had never seen such a thing, not in all his years of rigid guardianship. The ancient story was true. He looked from the glowing fungi to Alara, his world, you tilting on its axis. "I will grant you a temporary truce," he said, the words seeming to cost him a great effort. "But understand, this proves nothing beyond a momentary favor. The forest is capricious. Their alliance was born, thin and brittle as early winter ice. He was bound by the evidence of his own eyes, and she was driven by a desperate urgency. As they moved on, the tension between them was a living thing. He saw a reckless impulse in her every action, while she chafed at his slow, methodical caution. They had to navigate not only the treacherous, root-choked paths of the woods, but also the vast wilderness of their mutual distrust. It was Alara who finally broke the strained silence, deciding to trust him with the core of her dangerous theory. "The problem is not that the magic is gone, Kale," she began, choosing her words with care. "The problem is that it has fallen out of balance. I believe the forest's magic is an ecology, a complete living system, just like the relationship between the trees and the fungi beneath our feet. The trees provide sugars to the fungi, and the fungi bring them water and nutrients. It is a silent partnership. Our ancestors must have understood this. They knew the magical flow between all living things was a delicate web. But your traditions, the laws of non-interference, they have forgotten this. You guard a system you no longer actively sustain." The words hung in the air, forbidden and heavy. By speaking them, Alara had irrevocably bound their fates. If her theory was wrong, she was not just a lawbreaker, but a corrupter, leading a guardian astray with blasphemous ideas. She would have poisoned the very well she sought to cleanse. But if she was right, this shared, dangerous knowledge was their only hope. The path ahead was no longer just about survival. It was about unity, a concept as foreign and treacherous to them both as the blooming of moon-touched fungi. The ground beneath their feet began to change. A faint, subterranean glow pulsed through the soil, seeping between the roots like liquid emerald. Kale halted, his hand raised in a silent warning. He had never seen the forest's heart light exposed like this, bleeding into the open. Alara knelt, her botanist's instincts taking over. She carefully brushed away the damp leaf litter and black soil, revealing a tangled web of roots that shone with an inner light. They were not just roots, she realized. They were pathways, a vast living network carrying the forest's consciousness and power. This was the system she had theorized, made visible. With painstaking care, she began to trace the luminous lines, using a stick to sketch a rough map in the earth. She followed the flow of light, noting where it pulsed strong and vibrant, and where it sputtered and died. Her mapping revealed a terrifying pattern. The blight was not a random sickness. It traced a perfect, devastating path along a series of severed connections. Several of the glowing roots were cleanly cut, their ends withered and dark. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the forest's circulatory system. Kale's face was a grim mask. This is a desecration, a violation of the deepest law. My duty is to guard this place, to contain the damage and prevent further intrusion. Alara looked up at him, her hands covered in glowing soil. Containment is a slow death sentence. If the circulatory system is cut, you do not just guard the patient, you must perform surgery. We have to repair the damage. Their conflict was immediate and fundamental. He saw a wound that must be isolated. She saw a patient that must be healed. The tension between them crackled in the air, as tangible as the mist around them. Their shared discovery had only deepened the divide in their purpose. Her eyes fell upon one of the severed roots, its light fading by the second. Without another word of debate, she made her decision. Reaching into her satchel, she pulled out a length of silvery vine, a resilient creeper she cultivated for its incredible vitality. This is a risk, she whispered, more to herself than to Kale. The forest could reject it, or it could see the graft as an attack, but doing nothing is a guaranteed failure. Her hands moved with a precise, gentle confidence. She cleaned the withered ends of the luminous root, then carefully spliced the living vine between them, binding the connection with strands of soft moss. She poured her focus into the join, not forcing her will, but encouraging a partnership, a bridge. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, a flicker of green light traveled down the silvery vine. It reached the severed end and jumped the gap, flowing into the dormant root beyond. The light steadied, then began to pulse in a slow, steady rhythm, matching the beat of the surrounding network. A wave of vibrant energy washed outward from the repair, and the nearby foliage seemed to sigh, perking up as if given a long-needed drink. The graft had worked. But their moment of triumph was chilling. The clean, precise cuts on the other roots could not have been made by an animal or a natural disaster. This was the work of intelligence, and the recent withering of the severed ends meant it was recent work. Their success had not gone unnoticed. By mending one break, they had announced their presence to the one who had made it. They were no longer just explorers in a dying wood. They were medics on a battlefield, and the enemy now knew they were there. The trail of severed roots led them to a cavern hidden behind a waterfall of shimmering, silent mist. Inside, the air hummed with a dissonant, painful energy. At the center of the cavern lay the source, a massive geode of crystalline rock that pulsed with a sickly, erratic light. This was the forest's heartstone, and a deep, jagged crack ran down its center. From that wound, raw magical energy bled out not as life, but as a creeping, black-vined corruption that choked the very stone. The corrupted energy did not simply dissipate. It coalesced, twisting the surrounding vegetation into aggressive, thorny tendrils that lashed out with a mindless hunger. The vines struck at them, forcing Alara and Kale into a frantic dance of evasion. "We must destroy them," Kale shouted, his staff already glowing with contained force. "They are a poison, and they must be purged." "No, wait," Alara cried out, ducking under a whip-like strike. "We have to understand this. If we just destroy the symptom, we do nothing to heal the disease. What if the corruption is a part of the magic itself, a part that is lost and hurting?" Their conflict was immediate, a clash of philosophies made urgent by physical danger. He saw a threat to be eliminated. She saw a symptom to be diagnosed, but the vines gave them no time for debate. They pressed in, tightening a thorny noose around the clearing. Alara saw Kale's defensive efforts being overwhelmed. She saw the crack in the heartstone flaring, about to release another burst of the corrupting energy. In that split second, a terrible, necessary idea formed. There was no conduit, no tool, no time for a careful ritual. There was only her. As the heartstone unleashed a wave of black energy, Alara did not run. She stepped forward, arms wide, and let the corruption flow into her. She became the conduit, a living vessel for the forest's pain. It was an agony beyond any physical wound, a cold fire that seared through her veins and threatened to extinguish her very self. But her sacrifice created an opening. For a single, crystal-clear moment, the corrupting energy was drawn into her form, leaving the heartstone's cracked core exposed and undefended. Kale did not hesitate. He channeled his power not at the vines, but at the flaw in the stone itself, a precise, concussive strike that sealed the crack with a sound like a mountain sighing. The attack ceased instantly. The thorny vines crumbled into inert dust. Alara collapsed to her knees, gasping. The violent energy was contained within her, no longer leaking, but its mark was left behind. Swirling across her arm and shoulder was a dark, intricate pattern, like tattooed shadow, a physical testament to the cost of their progress. She had saved them, and perhaps the heartstone, but she was now bound to the corruption in a way they could not understand. The immediate threat was gone, but the true source of the initial fracture, the intelligence that had sabotaged the roots and cracked the stone, remained a terrifying mystery. Her sacrifice was not an answer. It was the most urgent question of all. The dark patterns on Alara's skin pulsed with a cold, inner rhythm, a constant reminder of the poison she carried. Kale watched her, his usual sternness now layered with a grim, unfamiliar concern. He gathered smooth, river-worn stones from a nearby stream and a bowl of clear water. Placing the stones in a circle, he let a single drop of water from Alara's corrupted hand fall into the center. The water did not simply ripple. It swirled, the droplets coalescing into a miniature, shimmering map of the forest, with a single, dark thread of energy pulling insistently toward the distant, windswept cliffs. The ritual confirmed their deepest fear. The sabotage was deliberate, the work of a mind that knew exactly where to cut. Alara tried to hide a wince as a fresh wave of cold fire lanced up her arm. Her time was running out. Every hour the corruption sat inside her felt like a part of her own spirit was being eroded. Kale saw the tremor in her hands, the pallor of her skin. He had spent a lifetime upholding a law of non-interference, of watching from a distance, but watching her now, determined to see this through even as her body failed her, something in his resolve fractured. "You cannot face what lies ahead like this," he said, his voice low. "The forest's energy is hostile to you because it recognizes no anchor within you. You are a ship in a storm with no sail. I can teach you to raise one. It is a warden's technique, a way to visualize a shield." He guided her through the simple, mental exercise. It was not about blocking the energy out, he explained, but about giving it a shape to flow around, a vessel to contain it so it would not consume her. "Imagine a cup holding water," he instructed. "The water is still there, but it is not flooding the entire room." Alara closed her eyes, focusing past the pain. She pictured a vessel of woven light within her chest, and to her astonishment, the chaotic pressure within her eased, the cold fire receding to a manageable ache. It was not a cure, but it was a reprieve. This act of trust, of sharing a guarded secret of his order, changed everything between them. The brittle truce was replaced by a fragile, but real, partnership. Yet this new bond came with a terrible cost. They were now united in purpose, heading directly toward a confrontation with an unknown enemy, and their greatest asset was already wounded. Alara was stabilized, but she was not healed. She was a cup holding a tempest, and the journey to the high cliffs promised jolts and shocks that could shatter her concentration at any moment. The secret those cliffs held was no longer an abstract mystery. It was a destination, and their path toward it felt like walking a knife's edge. The windswept cliffs offered no shelter, only a raw, biting exposure. There, silhouetted against the pale sky, stood a lone figure. His hands were pressed against a raw fissure in the rock, from which a river of emerald light, a major ley line, flowed. But the energy was not flowing freely. It was being violently drawn into a cluster of dull, gray crystals he held, their surfaces beginning to glow with a harsh, concentrated light. This was Bryn, an earth mage, and he was not just stealing magic. He was bleeding the forest dry. Kale's voice was like cracking ice. He recognized the man, a former apprentice from a neighboring guild who had been cast out for his dangerous ambition. Bryn turned, his face gaunt and his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "The power is fading, Warden," he spat. "While you guarded empty traditions, I chose to save what I could. It is my right to claim a dying fire before it goes out forever. This is not salvation," Alara cried out, her own corrupted arm aching in sympathy with the wounded ley line. "This is consumption. You are not saving the magic, you are hoarding its corpse." Her words meant nothing to him. With a contemptuous flick of his wrist, Bryn unleashed the stolen power. The ground at their feet shuddered and broke apart. Boulders ripped themselves from the cliff face, hovering in the air before hurling toward them. The very earth they stood on became their enemy, as Kale raised shimmering shields of force, and Alara scrambled to avoid grasping hands of animated soil. In that chaotic storm of rock and light, the true battle was laid bare. Bryn believed in his right to seize a dying resource. Kale fought to preserve what remained by any means necessary, his staff blazing as he sought to shatter Bryn's crystals. And Alara saw only a sick system, a man so disconnected from the living network he served that he was killing the very thing he thought he was saving. She knew then that they could not win by breaking him. They had to remind him. As a shard of rock grazed her shoulder, she did not retaliate. Instead, she dropped her defensive posture and ran toward the ley line fissure, not toward Bryn. She slammed her hands, the one clean and the one marred by the dark pattern, directly onto the raw flow of energy. She did not take. She opened herself completely, using her own body as a bridge to channel the ley line's agonized scream directly into Bryn's consciousness. She showed him not with words, but with raw feeling. The withering of the moon touched fungi, the silent weeping of the sentinel tree, the desperate gasping of the root networks he had severed. For a single, frozen heartbeat, Bryn flinched. The barrage of stones faltered. He saw it. He felt the forest's pain as his own, a connection he had severed years ago. His face contorted in a war between memory and addiction, but the allure of the power he held was a physical craving. The crystals in his hand, overcharged and unstable, began to vibrate, emitting a high, dangerous whine. The energy within them churned, no longer contained, threatening to detonate and scald the land clean of life for miles. His moment of clarity had passed, replaced by the panic of a man holding a lit bomb. The confrontation was no longer about winning. It was about surviving the imminent explosion he had created. The crystals shrieked, a sound that tore the air itself. Raw power bled from their fractures, a blinding, chaotic storm that threatened to rip the cliffside apart. Kale moved without hesitation, his staff slamming into the earth. A dome of shimmering force erupted around the unstable crystals, a desperate container for the explosion. But he could not hold the energy itself, only its physical blast. The magical surge was a wild river about to burst its dam. Alara saw it all in a single, terrifying glance. There was no tool, no ritual. There was only the path. She threw herself forward, plunging her hands directly into the raw, screaming torrent of the ley line. Her body became the regulator, the living conduit she had theorized about. She did not try to control the flow, only to guide it, to let the excess power surge through her and dissipate harmlessly into the air and earth around them. It was a white-hot agony, 1,000 times worse than the Heartstone's corruption. The dark patterns on her arm flared like black lightning, and for a moment, she was not a woman, but a vessel of pure, screaming energy. Then, with a final, deafening silence, it was over. The crystals went dark and dull, crumbling to dust within Kale's shield. The violent light from the ley line fissure faded to a soft, dormant glow. The surge was stabilized. Alara collapsed, utterly unconscious, her body a battlefield of spent power and lingering poison. The immediate crisis had passed, leaving a grim aftermath. Bryn lay on the ground, not in triumph, but in hollow defeat, his ambition finally shattered by the consequences he had nearly unleashed. He was broken and remorseful. Kale stood over them both, his breath ragged. His duty, his entire life's code, demanded punishment, exile, or worse, for such a profound violation. But as he looked from the broken mage to the unconscious woman who had just saved everything, a new thought, unbidden, took root. Punishment would only create another wound. It would not heal the one Bryn had inflicted. So Kale made a choice that would have been unthinkable just days before. He did not raise his staff in judgment. Instead, he approached Bryn and placed a hand on his shoulder, not to harm, but to bind. He wove a temporary, restrictive ward around the man's own magical core, a leash that could not be broken until the damage was repaired. "Your sentence is not exile," Kale said, his voice weary but firm. "Your sentence is restoration." You will remain here. You will use your knowledge of the earth, not to steal, but to mend. You will nurse this ley line back to health until it flows strong again. It was an act of mercy, a precedent of redemption over retribution. But as Kale turned his attention to Alara, he knew this hard-won victory was incomplete. The forest's central system was now critically weakened, its main artery fallen silent. Containing an explosion and assigning a gardener would not be enough. The true heart of the forest was still calling, its voice growing fainter, and now its most unlikely champion was unable to answer. Consciousness returned to Alara as a slow, painful tide. Every muscle ached with a deep exhaustion, and the dark patterns on her arm felt like frost etched into her skin. She found Kale keeping a silent vigil nearby, his gaze fixed on the dormant ley line. Bryn was already at work under his watchful eye, his hands moving over the stone with a new, penitent focus. Seeing the fragile progress, Alara knew it was not enough. Stabilizing one line was like bandaging a single cut on a body, bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The entire system needed its immune system back. She pushed herself upright, her voice raspy but clear. We have to go further than mending broken lines. The forest did not originally heal itself. It was helped. Our ancestors did not just protect the magic, they cultivated it with partners. We have to reintroduce the spore weavers. Kale recoiled as if she had suggested setting the woods on fire. The spore weavers, they are a forbidden name for a reason. They were purged from every record and root tale for their chaos. They did not regulate magic. They warped it, twisted living things into monstrous shapes. To invite that back is to risk a plague, not a cure. But my research, Alara insisted. The old scrolls hinted they were not monsters. They were architects. Think of them as the mycelial network for magic itself. A healthy forest has fungi that connect trees, sharing nutrients and warnings. The spore weavers did the same for raw magical energy. They absorbed the excess and redistributed it to the starving areas. They were the balancing pulse. Our ancestors feared their unpredictability and scorched them from the earth, but in doing so, they removed the forest's natural thermostat. We have been trying to live in a world without its lungs ever since. This was the chasm between them, wider and deeper than any physical gorge. Kale saw a historical threat that had been rightfully eliminated. Alara saw a missing organ, without which the patient could never truly recover. His entire identity was built on guarding against such dangers. Her entire hope was built on resurrecting them. Then I will go alone, she said, her decision calm and final. She began gathering her few belongings, her movements stiff but determined. I cannot stand by and watch this system suffocate in its own purity. If the only path to life is through a forgotten fear, then I will walk it. You can remain here and uphold a law that is slowly killing everything you swore to protect. Her words were not an attack, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. They forced Kale to a precipice far more terrifying than any cliff edge. He could let her go and possibly watch the last, best hope for the forest walk to her death for a blasphemous dream. Or he could follow her and betray the most fundamental tenet of his order, embracing the very entity his people had sworn to eradicate. The survival of the entire living system now hinged on a choice between the safety of a known decline and the terrifying, uncertain hope of a symbiotic past. And so, a journey was beginning, not across land, but into the deepest, most forbidden memory of the woods themselves. The entrance was not a cave, but a living throat. A colossal, phosphorescent mushroom, its gills pulsing with a soft blue light, formed an archway into the earth. The air that breathed from it was thick and sweet, smelling of damp soil and ozone. Kale hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming that this was a descent into the belly of the very chaos his order had spent generations erasing. But Alara stepped through without a backward glance, and the choice was, once again, made for him. He followed her into the deep, humming dark. They did not walk on stone, but on a springy, living lattice that glowed beneath their feet. This was the Mycelial network, a subterranean universe of interconnected fungal threads that stretched into an impossible, luminous infinity. It was the forest's true nervous system, and the sheer scale of it stole their breath. But the awe was quickly tempered by a grim discovery. While some pathways shone with vibrant, pulsing color, vast stretches of the network were pale and silent, their light guttered out like dead stars. These were the places starved of the spore weaver's influence, the magical deserts where the forest's consciousness could no longer flow. The network was not a passive landscape. It was a mind, and it knew they were there. As they ventured deeper, the air around them shimmered. For Kale, the world dissolved into a vision of the cliffside. But this time, Alara lay still and cold on the ground, the forest around them withering to dust as he stood by, powerless and too late. The illusion fed on his deepest fear, that his caution and rigid adherence would ultimately lead to the very ruin he sought to prevent. For Alara, the test was a cruel inversion. She looked down to see the dark corruption on her arm spreading, consuming her, twisting the beautiful, glowing threads beneath her feet into the same black, thorny vines they had fought in the cavern. She was becoming the blight, the very disease she had sacrificed everything to heal. They could have fought the visions, denied the doubts, but they understood this was not a battle to be won with force. It was a truth to be surrendered to. To prove their worth, they had to offer a piece of themselves. Alara went first. She closed her eyes and let go of the memory of her first garden, the simple, profound joy of a 6-year-old watching the first green shoot push through the dark soil, a feeling of pure, life-giving connection. The memory flowed from her like a tangible thing, a shimmering green leaf that drifted into the network. The pale threads around her brightened momentarily, drinking it in. Kale's offering was slower, more painful. He released the memory of his first successful act as a warden, the day he had calmed a territorial spirit, not with force, but with a respectful offering, feeling the forest's approval settle over him like a warm cloak. It was the moment his duty had transformed from a chore into a calling. He offered that pride, that sense of belonging, and watched as a fragment of golden light left him to join Alara's. The network absorbed their gifts, and the hostile illusions vanished, replaced by a single, overwhelming wave of gratitude. A new pathway ignited before them, a river of brilliant gold leading to a secluded, crystalline hollow. There, resting on a pedestal of woven roots, was their prize, a small, unassuming cluster of dormant spores. But with the reward came a final, devastating warning. The network showed them a vision of the entire system, not just this forest, but all interconnected wild places, flickering and going dark one by one, like a string of lights whose fuse had been severed. Their mission was no longer just about saving a single wood. They were holding a match against a gathering global darkness. The final component was in their hands, and the weight of every sleeping forest now rested on their shoulders. The crystalline hollow was a sanctuary of utter silence. At its center, resting within a geode of softly chiming crystals, lay the spore cluster, glowing with a gentle, internal light. But between them and their prize stood the vault's final guardian. It was not a beast of tooth and claw, but a magnificent, terrifying being of woven bark and shimmering leaves, its form radiating an ancient, patient intelligence. It did not growl or threaten. It simply watched them, and in its gaze, they felt the weight of millennia. A low hum filled the air as 3 pedestals of living wood rose from the floor, each holding a different magical plant. One was a flower whose petals slowly opened and closed like a breathing heart. Another was a vine that pulsed with a soft, golden light. The third was a thorny shrub that seemed to absorb the very light around it. The Guardian's challenge was not a battle, but a question made physical. Align them, its voice echoed in their minds, not with force, but with understanding. Kale's hand tightened on his staff. "I can feel the energy patterns," he said, his voice strained. "The flower represents growth, the vine represents connection, the thorns represent protection. We must arrange them to create a stable flow." He focused his will, trying to command the plants into a triangle of power. But the moment he pushed, the flower wilted and the vine recoiled. His approach, all structure and control, was failing. "You are trying to command life," Alara said softly. "You cannot order a seed to sprout. You can only give it what it needs and trust it to grow." She closed her eyes, extending her senses not to the plant's magical signatures, but to their living rhythms. She felt the flower's yearning for the vine's nourishing light, the vine's need for the thorn's defensive shelter, and the thorn's quiet reliance on the flower's vibrant energy to draw life from the air. It was not a circuit of power, but a circle of mutual need. She showed Kale this delicate dance of interdependence, not with words, but by letting him feel the ebb and flow through her own connection. His rigid focus softened. Together, their approaches merged. He used his knowledge of magical forms to identify the points of contact, the precise angles where energy could be gently shared. She used her empathy to guide the plants, encouraging them to lean toward one another, to offer and accept support. He provided the architecture, and she provided the life. Slowly, gently, they guided the 3 plants into a new configuration, their leaves and stems intertwining until they formed a single, symbiotic sculpture. The flower bloomed brilliantly, its light feeding the vine, which in turn wove a protective net around the thorns, which then stood guard over the flower's roots. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the hollow. The guardian plant beast bowed its great head, and the geode containing the spores opened fully. "You have passed the final test," the guardian's voice whispered, fading. "You understand that balance is a relationship, not a formula, but the effort of maintaining this trial has consumed the last of my power. The vault is now open and unguarded. Others will come. They will sense this treasure, and they will not understand its purpose, only its power. The spores were in their hands, but the victory was bitter. They had proven themselves worthy, yet in doing so, they had stripped the last defense from the very thing they sought to save. The race was no longer against a slow decay. It was a desperate sprint against the clock and the greed of the world, a final, urgent dash to heal the heart of the forest before new hands could steal its last hope. The dormant heartstone awaited them, its deep silence more unnerving than any scream. Bryn's hands, once used for theft, now worked with a penitent's care, clearing the last of the black-vined corruption from the ley line fissure. He created a clean, precise channel, an entry point for their impossible hope. Kale stood guard, his staff pulsing with a soft, steady light as he wove a containment field around the area, a necessary precaution against the volatility to come. With a final, steadying breath, Ilara opened the small pouch. The spores drifted out, not like dust, but like tiny, sentient embers, and she guided them toward the waiting stone. The moment they touched the raw energy of the ley line, the world erupted into silent, vibrant life. Threads of brilliant, pulsating energy shot through the heartstone's gray surface, branching out like lightning-fast roots. The entire network began to glow, a subterranean aurora visible through the soil. The initial success was breathtaking, but it was immediately terrifying. The new energy was a wild, untamed river, and the old, damaged network could not contain its flow. The system shuddered, threatening to tear itself apart. A single misstep from any of them, a flicker of doubt from Bryn, a waver in Kale's containment, and the chain reaction would scour the forest's heart clean. Ilara felt the instability like a physical tremor in her own bones. She was the weakest link, her body still a fragile vessel for the old corruption. Yet she saw only one path forward. She made the choice without speaking, throwing her own defenses wide open. She let the newborn network draw directly on her life force, using her own spirit as an anchor to steady the frantic, pulsing energy. It was the ultimate act of trust, a complete surrender to the symbiotic relationship she had always believed in. The gamble worked. The wild energy surge softened, finding its rhythm, weaving itself into the ancient stone and the waiting mycelial pathways with a deep, resonant hum. The forest drew its first full breath in centuries, but the cost was absolute. As the system stabilized, Ilara's legs gave way. She collapsed, not into unconsciousness, but into a state of profound, unbreakable connection. Her eyes, when they fluttered open, held the shifting, ancient green of the deep woods. Her fate was no longer her own. She had not just healed the forest, she had become a part of it. A deep, resonant hum rose from the earth, a vibration that was not a sound but a feeling, the forest's long silent heart beginning to beat again. As the spore weavers spread through the root networks, the change was not subtle. Ancient trees, once stooped and weary, straightened their massive trunks with groans of living wood. The muted greens of the foliage deepened into impossible, vibrant emeralds, and flowers of dazzling, unnameable colors burst from the soil in spontaneous celebration. But the most profound shift was in the air itself, now filled with a complex chorus of clicks, rustles, and soft, melodic pulses. This was not random noise. It was a language, the true voice of the woods returning after an age of silence. The magical ecology, once a list of broken rules, began to govern itself. In the distance, they watched as a patch of gray blight simply dissolved, the soil darkening with rich life as healthy moss crept over it without any of them lifting a finger. The system was self-correcting, pushing back the corruption on its own. Yet this incredible power was also a new danger. The sheer force of the awakening was a tidal wave of life, and it threatened to overflow its channels, washing away the fragile, newly healed areas in a surge of uncontrolled vitality. Kale watched the flows of energy, no longer seeing threats to be contained, but currents to be guided. His entire world, you shifted in that single, overwhelming moment. He finally saw it, not as a set of laws, but as Alara's living, breathing ecology. He lowered his staff, closed his eyes, and began to direct the flows not with force, but with a gentle, intuitive understanding, like a shepherd guiding a river. He was no longer a warden guarding a border. He was a gardener tending a vast, magical garden, but such a miracle could not stay hidden. The light show in the sky, and the sudden, thunderous return of life to the silent wood drew every eye in the village. Led by the stern, gray-robed members of the Warden Council, a crowd gathered at the forest's edge. They witnessed the trees straightening and the colors intensifying, a spectacle that defied all their teachings. They saw a miracle, but their faces showed only shock and fear. They were completely unprepared for the reality of a living system they had been taught was dead and dangerous. The trio's success had not ended their struggle. It had summoned the very judgment they had sought to avoid, and a reckoning with the old world now stood watching from the border, its laws poised against the new life they had fought so hard to restore. The silence at the forest's edge was broken by the stern voice of Archwarden Valerius. His gray robes seemed to absorb the vibrant light around him, and his face was a mask of rigid disbelief. "You have unleashed a plague," he declared, his gaze sweeping over Alara, Kale, and Bryn. "You violated our most sacred laws and meddled with forces that were rightly purged from this world. By the authority of the Warden Council, you are hereby placed under arrest, and this abomination will be cleansed from the woods." His words were a cold blade, aimed not just at them, but at the newly awakened life, humming all around. It was the ultimate confrontation, a clash between centuries of rigid dogma and the undeniable, vibrant results blooming before their very eyes. Kale stepped forward, his own posture straightening with a new kind of authority. "Archwarden, look at what surrounds you. The blight is gone. The silence is broken. This is not a perversion. It is a restoration." But Valerius was unmoved. "A temporary resurgence built on a foundation of chaos is no restoration. It is a fever, and it will burn itself out, taking the entire forest with it. Your actions are a danger to every soul in the village." As council guards moved to obey, Alara did not cower or plead. She simply walked forward, her movements fluid and unafraid, her eyes holding the ancient green of the deep woods. She did not look at the armed guards. She looked at the forest. She did not defend herself. She extended a hand, palm open, and in a voice that was both hers and something infinitely older, she whispered a single, soft invitation. The response was immediate and breathtaking. The very air stilled, thick with a sudden, benevolent awareness. From the canopy above, a cascade of luminous pollen drifted down like gentle snow. Vines, vibrant and pliable, uncurled from the trees and brushed against the arms and wrists of the stunned council members. The touch was not a restraint, but a curious, tender greeting, like a child taking the hand of a stranger. A single, perfect flower, the color of dawn, bloomed at Valerius' feet. The Archwarden flinched, his stern composure cracking for the first time as he stared at the living, breathing evidence coiling around his own arm. This was no mindless force. This was an intelligence, a consciousness, and it was welcoming them. The old laws, carved in stone and fear, were being rewritten not by argument, but by a simple, undeniable touch. The forest itself was speaking its defense, and its first word was peace. A brittle silence held the glade, broken only by the rustle of curious vines. Archwarden Valerius stared at the flower blooming at his feet, then at the gentle, living tendril wrapped around his wrist. The stern dogma of a lifetime warred with the undeniable truth, touching his own skin. This was not a plague, it was a presence. His gaze swept from the vibrant, humming woods to the faces of his people, their fear slowly giving way to wonder. The old laws demanded control, but the forest offered only connection. With a deep, shuddering breath, Valerius made his choice. He raised his staff, the ancient symbol of the warden's authority, and with a sharp crack that echoed through the clearing, he broke it over his knee. The sound was not of violence, but of release. "I have guarded a corpse," he declared, his voice thick with emotion, while calling it preservation. "No more. From this day, we are not wardens of a prison. We are stewards of a living world." His act was a seismic shift, shattering centuries of tradition in a single moment. The old taboos were lifted, and the village was formally invited to cross the border, not as trespassers, but as students and partners. But such a profound change could not be unanimous. While many wardens stepped forward, their own staves lowered in acceptance, a handful stood rigid, their faces masks of betrayal. They saw not a new covenant, but a surrender to the very chaos their order was founded to oppose. One by one, they turned their backs, laying their unbroken staves at Valerius's feet before walking away into a self-imposed exile. This schism was a fresh wound in the fragile new peace, a reminder that healing the land was one thing, but healing generations of fear was another. To guide this nascent era, a new leadership was needed. Valerius, his own authority now transformed, turned to the three who had risked everything. He offered them joint stewardship of the forest and its relationship with the people. Ilara, her spirit forever intertwined with the woods, would represent healing and symbiotic knowledge. Kale, the reformed warden, would embody the new guardianship, one of guidance rather than control. And Bryn, the redeemed mage, would stand for the power of restoration and redemption. Together, they formed a living bridge between the human world and the magical ecology. They accepted not as rulers, but as guides, a triumvirate that mirrored the three plants they had aligned in the vault. Their greatest challenge now lay not in battling corruption, but in nurturing a delicate and unprecedented social order. The forest was healed, but the human heart remained a wilderness of its own. A new era had truly begun, demanding a different kind of growth, one where trust had to be cultivated as carefully as any magical spore. The first lesson was held in a sun-drenched clearing where the air itself seemed to listen. Ilara did not stand before the gathered villagers and their wide-eyed children as a lecturer, but as a guide. She asked them to sit on the soft moss, to place their hands flat on the earth, and to simply listen. Not with their ears, she explained, but with their hearts. She taught them to feel the subtle hum of the mycelial network beneath them, a sensation like a distant, friendly conversation. She showed them how a gentle thought of gratitude, offered to a wilting flower, could encourage it to lift its petals toward the sun. This was not a secret art for the chosen few. It was a language everyone could learn, a way of understanding magic, not as a power to be seized, but as a shared resource to be tended, like a village well. The consequences of this simple act rippled through the community with a speed that astonished the old wardens. The village gardener, who had struggled for years with blighted soil, found that a respectful request to the earthworms brought them swarming to aerate his fields. The crafters discovered that wood taken from fallen branches, after asking the tree for its permission, held a stronger, more vibrant grain. Fear was replaced by a sense of belonging, a dawning realization that they were not living beside the forest, but within a vast, interconnected body. They were forming their own small, positive bonds, becoming individual cells in a newly healthy system. But any new system faces tests of its integrity. A few opportunistic holdouts, seeing the forest's renewed vitality as an untapped marketplace, saw their chance. A pair of brothers, skilled woodcutters, slipped past the informal patrols and began to harvest strips of luminous bark from the sentinel trees, believing they could sell them as powerful charms. They did not ask, they only took. This was the first real infraction, a direct challenge to the fragile new covenant. How would the stewards respond? The old laws demanded harsh punishment, perhaps even exile. Cale and his reformed wardens located the brothers not with anger, but with a calm, deep disappointment. He did not confiscate their tools or threaten them with prison. Instead, he sat with them and explained the damage. He showed them how the bark was not dead material, but a living conduit, and that stripping it was like cutting a vital artery. Then he delivered their sentence. They would not be punished. They would be educated. Their assignment was to assist Bryn for a full cycle of the moon, helping him mend the very ley lines their actions had weakened. They would use their strength not for extraction, but for restoration. This compassionate approach proved far more effective than any scare tactic ever could. Forced to work with the earth and see the delicate flows of energy up close, the brothers' greed transformed into a grudging respect, and then into genuine fascination. They became some of the most vocal advocates for the new ways, their first-hand experience a powerful tool for convincing other skeptics. This single act solidified the new covenant, proving that the forest's ecology was not a separate entity. It included people, too. The system was not just being protected by its inhabitants. It was learning from them, adapting to include their capacity for both error and redemption, and in doing so, becoming truly whole. The forest's new song held a hidden harmony, a pull that reached beyond the familiar borders of the trees. Ilara felt it first, a subtle tug in her spirit as she tended the heartstone. The spore weavers were not merely restoring their home, they were reaching out, sending delicate, exploratory threads of energy, questing through the ley lines that stretched across the continent like dormant nerves. The network was not just healing, it was weaving itself back together, seeking connection with other lost fragments of the world's magical ecology. This revelation arrived not with a shout, but with a whisper of shared longing. One evening, as Cale monitored the energy flows, he registered a faint, rhythmic pulse echoing back from an impossible distance, a signal from another isolated grove, singing a lonely, answering note. Their forest was not a solitary kingdom. It was one node in a vast, global web that had been shattered for centuries, and their success had just reawakened its desire to be whole. The sheer scale of the potential and the responsibility that came with it was staggering. Should they answer the call? Should they pour their fragile, hard-won resources into reaching across continents to heal a broken world? The three stewards stood together in the glowing hollow, the weight of the choice pressing down on them. Bryn, his hands still remembering the feel of stolen power, argued for caution. To reach out blindly is to risk everything we have built here. Our connection is new, our understanding is a sapling. We could drain our own forest dry, trying to water a desert we have never seen. Kale, the former warden, agreed, but for a different reason. A beacon attracts more than just the lost, he warned. It draws the desperate and the greedy. If we reveal our strength before we fully understand it, we may invite a storm we cannot weather. Ilara, her consciousness forever linked to the woods, felt the pull most keenly, yet she was the one who counseled patience. Our first duty is to our home, she said, her voice calm but resolute. We must become a library before we can become teachers. We must learn the full grammar of this living system, document its rhythms, and understand its failures and triumphs. Only then can we offer a true gift to the world. Their decision was unanimous. They would not launch a reckless crusade. Instead, they would dig their roots deep, transforming their forest into a living laboratory, a sanctuary of knowledge. They established a permanent research outpost at the Heartstone, a collaboration between reformed wardens, curious villagers, and the forest's own intelligent flora. Their mission was to listen, to learn, and to grow strong. This choice, to consolidate rather than conquer, positioned their home as something far more valuable than a power source. It was becoming a potential future beacon and a library of lost wisdom for a global restoration that might one day be possible. But that hope was a seed they now had to nurture into an unshakable tree. The real work, the meticulous, unglamorous task of proving that a human magical symbiosis could not only survive but thrive, was just beginning. Their success or failure would determine whether this single, healed forest would remain a beautiful, isolated miracle, or become the first chapter in the world's long-awaited healing. The Heartstone's pulse became Ilara's second heartbeat. Each morning, she would settle before the great crystal, her hands resting lightly on its warm surface, and simply listen. It was not a quiet meditation, but an immersion in a roaring river of data. The pulses were a language of light and vibration, conveying the forest's thirst after a dry night, the joyful spread of a new mycelial thread, or the quiet distress of a sapling struggling for light. She learned to interpret its complex grammar, feeling the ecosystem's health not as an abstract concept, but as a direct, physical sensation flowing through her. It was during one of these deep listening sessions that she first heard the whispers. They were not part of the forest's vibrant chorus. These were faint, fragmented signals, like echoes from the bottom of a deep well. They came from far beyond their borders, carried on ley lines so weak they were barely more than memories. One was a desperate, repeating plea for light from a petrified woodland. Another was a mournful hum from a swamp whose waters had turned to stagnant poison. They were cries for help from other dormant heartstones, forgotten ecologies screaming into a silent void. Each intercepted signal was a psychic blow, leaving her mentally drained and physically weary. She began to walk a razor's edge, torn between her flourishing duties at home and the agonizing pull of a world in pain. She could not bear this burden alone. Gathering kale and Bryn at the hearthstone, she placed their hands upon it beside hers. "You need to hear this," she said, her voice thin with exhaustion. She guided them, teaching them the basics of the stone's language, how to distinguish the local hum from the distant, desperate static. It was slow, painstaking work, like teaching someone to read by holding their hand over lines of braille etched into lightning. But they learned. Kale's disciplined mind began to categorize the signals by their magical frequency, while Bryn's earthy sensitivity helped trace their geographic origin. The shared responsibility transformed their partnership, forging a bond as strong as the roots beneath them. They were no longer just three individuals. They had become the forest's central nervous system, its official council for interpreting a world's worth of intelligence. This profound unity, however, came with a sobering confirmation. Their local success, the vibrant life they had fought so hard to restore, was just a single, shining point of light in a vast and encroaching darkness. The world was not simply waiting to be healed, it was actively calling out, and now they could no longer pretend they did not hear it. The scout stumbled into the hearthstone clearing, his cloak caked with the gray dust of a foreign blight. In his hands, he carried not just a report, but a promise. It was a small, withered sapling, its leaves curled and brittle, pulled from a dying forest many miles to the east. But at its core, a single, tenacious root glowed with a faint, green light where he had applied a dusting of their own spore weaver spores. The sapling had responded. This was the tangible proof they had needed, a physical bridge between their local miracle and the desperate whispers Alara heard in the stone. Their methods were not a fluke. They were a key, and it could turn locks far from home. Yet the scout's words carried a chilling counterpoint. The blight in that eastern wood was different, he reported. It was not a passive decay, but an active, malevolent force. It moved with a purpose, strangling healthy trees with black, crystalline vines that seemed to absorb light and sound, leaving a void in their wake. The signal Alara had interpreted as a cry for help was also a scream of warning. The council faced a dilemma wrapped in a victory. They had their proof, but it pointed toward a far more dangerous reality. Sending anyone into that was a risk, but to do nothing was to condemn that forest and ignore the very purpose of their hard-won knowledge. Bryn was the obvious, if unexpected, choice to lead the mission. Who better to navigate the temptations of a broken land than a man who had once sought to drain one? His understanding of earth magic was deep, and his redemption was a living testament to the philosophy they hoped to export. He would not go to conquer, but to offer, to listen, and to share. The team he selected was a mirror of their own triad, a reformed warden for guidance, a village gardener for empathy, and a naturalist for observation. They were the first seed of their ideology, sent to grow in hostile soil. As the team prepared to depart, the weight of the moment settled over the glade. This was no longer an internal matter. Their entire philosophy, the delicate balance of symbiosis and stewardship, was about to be tested in a laboratory of despair. Could their methods calm a malevolent blight? Could their teachings hold when the teachers were far away? The future of a global network, of a world reknitted with magic, now rested on the success of this single, diplomatic mission into the heart of the unknown. The air in the blighted wood tasted of ash and iron, Bryn's team found themselves surrounded not by trees, but by petrified sentinels, their branches clawing at a perpetually gray sky. The guardians of this place emerged from the shadows between the trunks, their forms woven from thorn and hardened resin, their eyes glowing with a hostile, amber light. They did not speak, but their message was clear, a wall of shimmering, sharp-edged force that materialized inches from Bryn's face. Their distrust was a physical barrier, forged by a history of betrayal. "We mean you no harm," Bryn called out, his hands open and empty. "We come from a forest that was also dying. We have brought a way to heal." A voice, rasping like stone, grinding on stone, echoed in their minds. Others came with such promises. They sought only to carve the last of our strength into trinkets. Your words are empty echoes. Every attempt to explain their symbiosis, to show the healthy sapling, was met with renewed aggression. The magical barrier constricted, pushing them back. A dangerous stalemate settled in, the very air crackling with the threat of violence. Bryn saw the futility of argument. These beings were not ignorant, they were wounded, and he understood that particular wound better than anyone. He knew a bridge could not be built with words alone. It had to be built with truth. "I will submit to your judgment," he announced, his voice steady despite the tremor in his heart. "I will open my memories to you. Let my past prove my present intent." A wave of shock, both from his own team and the Guardians, rippled through the clearing. A truth-reading ritual was a profound vulnerability, a surrender of one's deepest self. There could be no lies, no hidden motives. The lead Guardian gestured, and the thorny barrier parted just enough for Bryn to step through. He knelt on the cold, dead earth as a tendril of amber light, cold and sharp as a needle, touched his forehead. In that instant, he held nothing back. He showed them his own ambition, his desperate, greedy theft from the ley line on the cliffs. He let them feel his hollow triumph and the crushing horror of the near explosion. He showed them Kale's unexpected mercy and the long, penitent work of mending the earth with his own hands. He laid bare his shame and his redemption, not as a story, but as a raw, open nerve. The cold needle of light did not withdraw in anger. It softened, warming slightly, and the flood of hostile energy receded. The lead Guardian stared at him, its amber gaze now holding a flicker of something other than hate. It was recognition. "You carry your failure as a part of your strength," the rasping voice conceded. "This we have never seen. Your honesty has earned you a chance, not our trust." The barrier fell. The tentative truce was born. But as Bryn's team was finally allowed to approach the heart of the blight, their initial hope curdled into a new kind of dread. This corruption was not a passive sickness. The black, crystalline vines they had heard about pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat. When Bryn carefully sprinkled the first spore weaver spores near them, the vines did not wither. They recoiled, then lashed out, actively repelling the healing magic. The blight was not just a disease. It was aware. It was fighting back. Their diplomatic victory had not brought them to a patient, but to a battlefield, and the enemy had just revealed its intelligence. The spore weaver spores did not bring healing. They brought a declaration of war. As the faint, luminous dust settled on the black crystalline vines, the corruption did not dissolve. It writhed, pulling back like a scorched hand, before lashing out with a vicious, conscious intent. The ground itself turned against Bryn's team, becoming a treacherous bog that swallowed their tools. Twisted, thorny branches, once still, now whipped through the air, and from the petrified undergrowth emerged creatures of nightmare, wolves with pelts of jagged crystal and eyes burning with the same malevolent amber as the blight itself. This was no passive decay. It was a coordinated defense by a parasitic intelligence. The ambush was swift and brutal. Corrupted beasts, moving with a terrifying synchronicity, descended upon them. The reformed warden fought valiantly, his defensive shields flaring under the assault, but a crystalline claw found its mark, tearing a deep gash in his leg. The village gardener was thrown against a petrified trunk, her arm snapping with a sickening crack. Their progress was not just halted, it was violently reversed, their camp scattered, and their most potent remedies trampled into the poisoned soil. Watching from the ridges, the local guardians saw only failure. Their rasping voices filled Bryn's mind with recrimination. You have stirred the hive. Your methods are a provocation. We cannot stand with you and incur its full wrath. The fragile truce, built on the foundation of Bryn's painful honesty, frayed to a single, thin thread. They began to withdraw, their thorny forms melting back into the shadows, ready to abandon the outsiders to their fate. Retreat was the logical choice. It was the safe choice, but Bryn, kneeling beside his injured comrades, saw the flicker of despair in their eyes and remembered the long, patient work of mending the ley line on his own cliffs. He had been given a second chance not through caution, but through a radical act of trust. He stood and faced the retreating guardians. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the groans of the wounded. "This thing fights like a single mind. It defends its territory, so we do not fight the whole forest. We lure out the mind itself." His plan was a gambler's throw, a risk that made the guardians recoil in horror. He proposed using their remaining store of pure, concentrated spore weaver spores, the very essence of the healing magic, as bait. They would create a psychic beacon, a feast so tempting the blight's core consciousness would have to emerge to consume it. It was an offering that could either save them or doom them all. If the blight took the power and overwhelmed their trap, it would become unstoppable, empowered by the very life they had brought to save this place. But it was the only way to draw the hidden enemy into the open for a decisive confrontation. The team, battered but resolute, agreed. They would not run. They would engineer a final, desperate battle for the soul of the wood. The bait glowed with a terrible allure, a dense cluster of spore weaver spores, radiating pure, untamed life. Bryn did not simply scatter them. He and his team wove them, blending the spores with threads of their own protective magic and the local guardian's thorny resilience. They created not a trap, but a symbiotic filter, a beautiful, poisonous flower meant to be consumed. As predicted, the blight could not resist. A central mass of the black, crystalline vines surged forward, engulfing the beacon and drawing its power inward. For a moment, the corruption pulsed with a victorious, blinding intensity. Then the true counterattack began from within. The refined spores, now inside the blight's core, did not try to destroy their host. They began to recalibrate it. They sought out the corrupted magical pathways and forged new, healthy connections, forcing the parasitic intelligence to experience the very symbiosis it had devoted itself to eradicating. The internal conflict was catastrophic for the blight. Its control shattered. All across the wood, crystalline vines crumbled to inert dust, and the amber light in the eyes of the corrupted beasts flickered and died. But its death throes were its most vicious weapon. A wave of pure psychic despair crashed over the team, a final, desperate assault, not on their bodies, but on their spirits. It projected their deepest fears into their minds' visions of their home forest, withering because of their failure, of their loved ones turning away in disgust, of their hard-won redemption dissolving into meaningless ash. The mental assault threatened to break them, to leave them hollow shells lost in their own private hells. In that moment of collective crisis, Bryn did not retreat into himself. He reached out, his mind grasping for the local head guardian. He offered not a command, but an invitation, a memory of the trust they had built through shared vulnerability. The guardian, feeling its own ancient despair being weaponized against it, understood. It joined its consciousness to Bryn's. Then the other team members and the remaining guardians all added their strength. Together, they did not build a wall. They wove a tapestry, a shared shield composed of their most resilient hopes, the memory of a first mended root, the vision of a future alliance, the simple, stubborn belief that growth was always possible. The blight's projections of despair shattered against this collective fortitude. With a final, silent scream, the central consciousness unraveled, its cohesion utterly lost. The victory was absolute. The malevolent intelligence was purged, leaving behind a scarred but cleansed forest, ready for true healing. But the effort had fused their minds at a fundamental level. A permanent, quiet channel now existed between Bryn and the head guardian, a cross-forest alliance forged in a shared psychic battle. They could now feel each other's vigilance, their concerns, their quiet determination. This connection did not weaken their home forest. It acted as a conduit, feeding the strength and knowledge gained from this distant victory back along the ley lines, enriching the core system and proving that their symbiotic model could not only heal, but also defend and unite. Deep within the newly cleansed forest, a faint green light began to pulse from its long dormant heartstone. Guided by Bryn's steadying presence, the stone did not simply awaken. It reached out, a conscious tendril of thought and energy, traveling the ley line back toward home. Ilara, meditating at her own heartstone, felt the approach like a familiar voice, calling from a great distance. She opened her spiritual arms, and the connection snapped into place. For the first time in centuries, two magical ecologies were no longer whispering into a void. They were holding a conversation. A gentle, reciprocal flow of vitality began to cycle between them, the distant forest drawing strength from their established health, while sending back new, resilient patterns of growth it had learned from surviving its blight. This was not just a link, it was a symbiosis spanning continents. Yet this miracle came with an immediate and constant cost. The connection demanded a low, steady drain of energy from both forests, a new form of metabolic upkeep for a body that had just learned it was part of a larger whole. Ilara felt the persistent draw like a faint, background hum, a reminder that their local resources were now supporting a distant need. Could they afford to sustain this link if another crisis struck at home? The balance between local duty and global responsibility had to be managed with care. Ilara and Kale moved swiftly, understanding that such a fragile thread could not be left to chance. They formalized the bond, creating a new role within their stewardship. A rotation of dedicated stewards was established, their sole focus to sit at the heartstone and nurture this nascent connection, reinforcing it with their own focused intention and ensuring the energy exchange remained stable and fair. This was no longer a random act of outreach. It was institutionalized diplomacy, the first dedicated embassy between living ecosystems. This successful, maintained connection changed everything. It transformed their forest from a solitary success story into the first active hub of a restored global network. They had proven that the shattered web of the world's magic could be consciously and deliberately rewoven, one thread at a time. Each steward taking their shift at the stone was not just maintaining a link. They were weaving a new reality, a future where every forest, every mountain, every river could one day sing in chorus again, their strength shared and their vulnerabilities supported by a world finally remembering it was whole. The air shimmered with shared delight during the first festival of roots. To mark a full year since the awakening, the village and the forest itself collaborated on a celebration of their bond, transforming the central clearing into a living spectacle of symbiotic joy. Children shrieked with laughter as they chased playful light wisps, tiny motes of consciousness that danced just out of reach before settling in their hair like glowing crowns. The great trees, once stern and silent, now bent their branches low, offering up fruits that pulsed with soft colors. A single bite of a sunset orange berry could let you understand the language of the birds for an hour, while a sip from a hollowed vine filled with sparkling sap brought the taste of a cool mountain spring to a warm afternoon. This was not a display of power, but a gift of experience, making the abstract concept of a living system into a tangible, delicious part of everyday life. The cultural shift was complete, woven into the fabric of their society through shared wonder. Yet watching from the edge of the clearing, a small group of visitors stood with rigid postures and crossed arms. They were traditionalists from a neighboring village, drawn by rumors of heresy, and their stern faces were masks of deep skepticism. They saw not a miracle, but a dangerous perversion of the natural order, a reckless dance on the edge of a cliff. Their critical eyes scanned the festivities, searching for any sign of the chaos they were certain must lie beneath the surface. Alara felt their hostile gaze like a cold draft. She could have asked the wardens to keep them at a distance, or she could have simply ignored them, letting their skepticism wither in the face of overwhelming evidence. But she remembered her own lonely journey into the woods and Kale's story of offering redemption over punishment. She walked directly toward them, her movements calm and open. Instead of a challenge, she offered an invitation. She held out her hands, palms up, in the traditional gesture of peaceful greeting. "You have come a long way to see this for yourselves," she said, her voice carrying over the music and laughter. "Do not just watch from the shadows. Please join us. Taste the fruit. Feel the air. There is no test here, only an offering." Her gesture was one of pure, unpressured trust. It disarmed them, leaving their prepared arguments with no enemy to confront. Hesitantly, one by one, the skeptics stepped forward. A stern woman reluctantly accepted a piece of glowing fruit, her eyes widening in shock as she suddenly heard the melodic thoughts of the stream. A hardened man allowed a light wisp to land on his calloused finger, and a slow, unwilling smile spread across his face at its simple, curious warmth. They did not hear a lecture on magical ecology. They felt it. They experienced the direct, positive connection, the sheer, unthreatening joy of being a welcome part of something vast and alive. The wall of their dogma, built over generations, could not withstand the simple, profound truth of a shared moment of happiness. While one or two remained stubbornly silent, the majority of the group were visibly transformed, their suspicion melting into a cautious, then eager participation. This single, gracious act did more than win an argument. It extended the network's reach, not through force or conversion, but through an open door. The trust that had healed a forest was now stretching its roots into a new community, proving that the most resilient bonds are forged not in debate, but in shared experience. The arrival of the scholar Lyra was heralded not by fanfare, but by the desperate rustle of ancient parchment and the scent of ozone clinging to her travel-worn robes. She was a historian and mage, exiled from the city-state of Ethel for the crime of listening too closely to whispers the ruling powers had declared heretical. She sought asylum, her only possessions a satchel of crumbling texts and a set of celestial charts, so old they seemed to hum with forgotten truths. Her research gave a name to the fragmented signals Alara had been hearing in the Heartstone. She called it the world song, the lost symphony of a planet-wide magical ecology. Her maps, painstakingly cross-referenced with star alignments, pinpointed the theoretical locations of other major Heartstones, their predicted positions aligning perfectly with the sources of the desperate psychic pleas. For the first time, the whispers had coordinates, yet this validation came with immediate friction. Lyra's world was one of theorems and meticulous academic proofs, and she viewed the trio's hard-won, intuitive methods as rustic and dangerously unscientific. She questioned Alara's deep listening trances, calling them unquantifiable emotionalism. She dismissed Bryn's earthy, experiential understanding of ley lines as mere folklore. Her arrogance was a shield born of a lifetime spent defending her work in hostile institutions, but it grated against the collaborative spirit the stewards had fought to build. The council chamber, once a place of unified purpose, now crackled with intellectual tension. Kale, forever the bridge between worlds, saw the impasse for what it was, a clash of two different languages describing the same miracle. He did not take sides. Instead, he proposed a synthesis that would force both to evolve. "We will use your maps as our foundation, Lyra," he stated, his calm voice a steadying force in the charged room. "But we will navigate them using our lived experience. Your theory will give us direction, and our practice will give us the vessel to sail there." It was a challenge to Lyra to see her life's work tested not in a lecture hall, but in the living laboratory of the world, and a reminder to his own partners that knowledge could come in many forms. This fusion of academic rigor and symbiotic wisdom supercharged their plans. Suddenly, their global outreach was no longer a series of hopeful signals sent into the dark. It became a targeted campaign. They could now prioritize which dying forests to contact based on the strategic importance of their Heartstones within the world song's theoretical lattice. But this accelerated progress came with a dire and unintended consequence. The very act of integrating Lyra's knowledge, of activating these distant nodes on her map, sent powerful ripples through the magical currents of the world. In the polished spires of Ethel, where magic was not a partner, but a resource to be metered and controlled, These ripples registered as a direct threat. An alarm had been tripped. The city-state that had cast Lyra out for her theories now knew she was not just a scholar with dangerous ideas, but the architect of a rival power, one whose influence was growing. Their sanctuary was no longer hidden. A political storm, armed with legions and a philosophy of domination, was now turning its gaze toward their fragile, flourishing woods. The emissary from Ethel arrived without warning, his polished steel armor and the grim-faced battle mages flanking him, a stark intrusion upon the forest's vibrant green. He stood rigid in the central clearing, his voice cutting through the morning's gentle hum like a shard of ice. By the authority of the magisterium, you will surrender the exile Lyra and cease all unsanctioned magical operations. Your reckless symbiosis threatens the structured stability of the entire region. This was not a request. It was a command, backed by the crackling energy gathering at the fingertips of his mages, creating the first military standoff the fledgling community had ever faced. Fear, a sensation long forgotten, began to coil through the gathered villagers. Whispers of dissent rose immediately. "We cannot fight a city-state," one elder argued, his voice trembling. "They have legions. We have trees and good intentions. This is a path to our ruin," another countered, her hand resting protectively on a vine that curled around her wrist. "And if we surrender our ways, what are we protecting? A slow death is still a death." The community was fracturing before the emissary's cold eyes, torn between the instinct for self-preservation and the conviction that their hard-won life was non-negotiable. In that moment of crisis, Ilara, Kale, and Bryn stepped forward as one. Their decision was swift and unified. "We will not surrender Lyra," Kale stated, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of the forest itself. "And we will not cease our practices, but we will not meet your threats with threats of our own. Instead, we offer you a choice. See what you have come to condemn." Ilara extended a hand, not in challenge but in invitation. "Walk with us. Let the forest speak for itself." The emissary, a man named Thuron, was taken aback. This was not the defiance or the cowering submission he was prepared for. Skeptical but bound by a thread of curiosity, he dismissed his mages to wait at the border and, with obvious reluctance, accepted the offer. The tour was a silent, profound argument. Ilara did not lecture. She simply led him to a grove where the trees themselves bent to offer him shade. She showed him how the stream's water, when cupped in his hands, showed fleeting visions of mountain sources. Bryn had a young sapling gently wrap a root around Thuron's armored boot, not to trap him, but to share a pulse of simple, joyful growth. They demonstrated the silent partnership between beetle and flower, the way the mycelial network distributed warning and nourishment without a single command being uttered. Thuron's rigid posture slowly softened. The disdain in his eyes was replaced by a dawning, troubled awe. He witnessed a child laughing as a light wisp settled on her nose, and he saw a reformed warden working with a gardener to gently persuade a patch of soil to yield more nutrients. A conversation, not a compulsion. He saw no weapons, no hierarchies of power, only an intricate, breathtaking dance of mutual support. By the end of the path, a profound conflict was etched on his face. "I see no threat here," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Only a beauty my city has forgotten how to dream of. But my orders are my orders. I am sworn to uphold the law of Ethel, and your existence challenges its very foundation. He stood at the edge of the woods, a man visibly torn between duty and a newly awakened conscience. He left them with a heavy heart and a grave warning. I will report what I have seen, but do not mistake my personal feelings for the will of the magisterium. They see a rival power, not a partner. Ethel is watching, and their patience is measured in quotas of control, not in seasons of growth. As he and his mages retreated, the temporary unity of the community settled into a grim, watchful silence. The peace they had built was real, but it was now encircled by a world that viewed harmony as heresy, and a single act of understanding was a frail shield against the gathering storm. The forest itself proposed the solution, a dream shared with Alara during her deep listening trance. It was a blueprint for a new kind of defense, not a wall, but a living, breathing filter. The entire community mobilized, a symphony of focused intent. Gardeners hummed to thorn vines, encouraging them to weave into dense, resilient lattices that pulsed with a soft amber light. Children sang to patches of light moss, teaching them to glow with a blinding, disorienting radiance when they sensed aggression. This was not a weapon. It was a question made physical, a barrier that asked every approaching soul what its true intentions were. The first test came with a trio of Ethelian scouts, their minds sharp with orders to map weaknesses. The moment they crossed the border with hostile purpose, the ward activated. The thorn vines did not strike. They coiled and shifted, creating an ever-turning maze that led the scouts in exhausting, futile circles. The light moss flared, not to burn, but to dazzle, erasing their sense of direction and leaving them disoriented and helpless. After hours of finding themselves back at their starting point, they were broken by confusion rather than force. They simply gave up and retreated. Not a single scout was harmed, not a single vine was raised in anger. They were not defeated, they were gently, firmly, and perfectly redirected. This flawless success, however, came at a steep price. The energy required to grow and maintain such a vast, intelligent system was immense. The council felt the drain immediately as a tangible slowing in the Heartstone's pulse. The distant, hopeful signals from other forests grew fainter, their answers delayed. The global network's growth, their grand project of reconnection, was forced to pause, its resources diverted to protect the heart of the operation. It was a painful trade-off, shielding their home at the cost of their wider mission. Faced with this difficult balance, the council's decision was unanimous. The safety of their community was the foundation upon which everything else was built. If they could not protect their home, there would be no network to expand. More importantly, the ward itself was a powerful proof of concept. It demonstrated to the world that security did not require violence, that a system could be both impregnable and humane. They chose to invest in this living shield, accepting the temporary slowdown as the cost of proving a new paradigm. In the polished war rooms of Ethel, the reports from the returned scouts caused profound confusion. Their strategists had prepared for magical artillery or summoned beasts, forces they could understand and counter. They had no tactical response for a defense that refused to fight. How do you declare war on an enemy that will not wage it? Attacking the forest now would not be a battle against an army, but a brutal assault on a system that had done nothing but peacefully turn them away. The ward had not just protected the border, it had reframed the entire conflict, forcing a city built on control to confront a power that was rooted in resilient, unyielding peace. The connection through the Heartstone pulsed with a new, rhythmic energy, a call sent across the winds to a society Alara had only ever seen in Lyra's star charts. These were the Sky Whalers, a people who rode the high currents in graceful, living vessels of woven cloud, their magic attuned to the tempests and the gentle breezes alike. They were a neutral power, respected by all for their detachment and their ancient wisdom. When their chieftain, a woman named Anya, with eyes the color of a gathering storm, appeared in the Heartstone's vision, she did not come with demands or suspicion. She listened, her expression unreadable, as Alara and Lyra shared the story of the awakened forest and its peaceful, living ward, the tale of a defense that refused to harm, that protected through redirection rather than retaliation, intrigued her. It was a concept as foreign to the political landscape as a tree growing in the sky. She agreed to act as a mediator. The mediation was held in a neutral expanse of open sky, a platform of solidified mist between the forest's edge and the distant spires of Ethel. The tension was a physical weight in the thin air. Ethel's chief delegate, Magister Valerius, laid out his city's terms with cold precision. They demanded oversight of all magical research, a registry of every Heartstone connection, and the right to veto any expansion of the symbiotic network. To him, these were reasonable safeguards. To the forest community, they were chains, a demand to cage the very wild, free-flowing life they had fought to restore. Kale's response was a quiet, unshakable refusal. "We will not compromise our freedom to grow," he stated. "A system built on control cannot nurture one built on trust." The talks stalled, teetering on the brink of collapse. It was then that Alara stepped forward, her voice calm amidst the brewing storm. She looked not at the Magister, but at the Sky Whalers, and then at her own people. "We have spent our strength learning how to heal," she began. "We have mapped the pathways of life, learned to mend broken roots and purify poisoned stones. This knowledge does not belong to us. It belongs to life itself, so we offer it to you, Ethel, freely and without condition. Take all of it. Our only request is that you use it for restoration, not domination." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the high wind. Magister Valerius stared at her, his carefully constructed arguments crumbling into dust. His entire world, the foundation of Ethel's power, was built on the hoarding of arcane secrets, on metering out magic in carefully controlled doses to maintain authority. This offer of open-handed generosity was an attack on the very core of his philosophy, a weapon he had no defense against. He could not call these people dangerous hoarders of power when they were giving their greatest treasure away. He could not justify a war against teachers who offered their lessons for free. The moral high ground Alara had claimed was not just a noble stance. It was a devastatingly effective strategy, creating a deep and visible fissure in the resolve of the Athelian delegation and leaving them utterly disarmed. The sky above the Heartstone darkened not with clouds, but with a presence. The Archmage of Ethel descended, her form clad not in steel, but in solidified command, a lattice of shimmering energy that sought to impose order upon the very air. In her hands, she held the relic of subjugation, a crystalline focus designed to silence any magic that that did not bend to a single, rigid will. Her intent was surgical, absolute, to sever the forest's chaotic heart and impose the peace of perfect control. She saw a rogue variable that threatened her city's equations, and she had come to erase it. Ilara, Kale, Bryn, and Lyra did not form a battle line. They stood in a circle around the glowing heartstone, their hands linked, their backs to the threat. Around them, the entire community stood in concentric rings, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, each one touching the shoulder of the person before them, a human chain rooted in the living earth. They were a single, silent organism, their collective focus turned inward, not outward. They offered no defense. They offered only a connection, as the Archmage unleashed a beam of pure, silver control magic, a force that had shattered rebellions and silenced entire schools of thought. It did not strike a shield. It plunged directly into the center of their circle, into the heartstone, and in that moment, they opened the floodgates. They became a living conduit, not for their own power, but for the world's song itself. The control magic did not meet resistance. It was met with an ocean. It flowed into the vast, humming network of the mycelial threads, into the joyful pulse of the distant, cleansed forest, into the lonely hope of the petrified wood, now beginning to stir, into the quiet strength of the sky whaler's high currents. It encountered the memory of a mended root, the sensation of a child's laughter, shared with a light wisp, the patient rhythm of a gardener's gratitude, the resilient peace of a ward that refused to harm. The Archmage's spell, designed to dominate and compartmentalize, was immersed in a symphony of interdependence it could not process. The magic did not break. It transformed, the intent to control, starved of an enemy to conquer, dissolved in the face of overwhelming, benevolent complexity. The silver beam softened, its harsh light warming to a gentle gold, and then it reversed its flow. It surged back into the Archmage, not as an attack, but as a gift, a wave of pure, shared vitality that washed through her weary spirit. She had spent a lifetime carrying the crushing weight of absolute authority, a burden that had carved a hollow ache deep within her soul she had learned to ignore. This energy, this connection, flowed into that emptiness, not filling it, but healing it. For the first time in decades, she felt not the heavy crown of command, but the light, sustaining touch of a world that asked for nothing but to be a part of her. A single, perfect tear traced a path through the dust of power on her cheek. The relic of subjugation fell from her numb fingers, striking the soft moss without a sound. She did not look defeated. She looked awakened. Her gaze swept over the silent, united community, over the pulsating heartstone, and she finally understood the report Thuron had struggled to articulate. This was not a rival power. It was an answered question, one her city had forgotten how to ask. The desire to control, the very foundation of her identity and her city's philosophy, had not been defeated by a greater force. It had been utterly, completely, and permanently dissolved by the simple, profound experience of being whole. The great harmonizing was not a battle won, but a silence broken, a single, rigid note, finally learning to harmonize with the world's vast and ancient song. In the wake of the Archmage's awakening, the city of Ethel did not simply sign a treaty. It began to dismantle itself. The gleaming spires, once symbols of absolute control, were repurposed into conduits for the new energy, their foundations entwined with living roots that taught the very stone to breathe. The magisterium, the seat of magocratic power, was dissolved and reborn as the first Stewards Guild, its members trading their robes of office for the simple, practical clothes of gardeners and listeners. They formally petitioned to join the network, not as overlords, but as humble students, eager to learn the language of a world they had only ever sought to command. This was not a surrender, but a homecoming. Ilara watched this transformation from the quiet of the Heartstone glade, her personal journey complete. The young botanist who had once stepped into the silent woods as an outlaw was now the quiet heart of a global movement. She found her deepest purpose not in grand ceremonies, but in the simple act of teaching. She showed Ethel's first stewards how to feel the mycelial web beneath their city's streets, and she guided the sky whalers in weaving cloud vessels that could carry not just people, but healing spores to distant, blighted shores. Her life was no longer her own, and in that surrender, she had found a fulfillment vaster than any she could have imagined. Beside her, Kale became the living embodiment of the new guardian. His staff, once a tool of containment, was now a conductor's baton, used to gently guide the flows of energy and intention between newly connected communities. He protected the forest not by building walls, but by fostering an ever-widening circle of trust. His stern passed a reminder of the cost of isolation. And Bryn, the redeemed earth mage, found his name forever etched into this new history as a synonym for bridge building. He traveled tirelessly, his first-hand knowledge of failure and redemption making him the most compelling ambassador to other broken lands. He did not bring armies or edicts, only a simple story and a pouch of spores, proving that the most resilient bridges are built from the materials of past mistakes. The forgotten ecology of magic was now a thriving, breathing reality. It was no longer a theory in a forbidden scroll or a whisper in the wind. It was the child in Ethel sharing her lunch with a talking squirrel, the crafter in the village receiving a vision for a new tool from the dreaming trees, the synchronized blooming of flowers across continents to celebrate a new connection. People, forests, and all magical life were inextricably woven into a single, vibrant tapestry. Their future was no longer a path to be walked, but a song to be composed together, an open and collaborative melody of continuous growth and discovery, each new voice adding its unique note to the everlasting chorus.